Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Performance Assurance webinar. My name is Jenny, and I'll be facilitating today's event. And today I'm joined by Anton, Andrew, and Alex. And just before we get started, I just want to go through some housekeeping with you. So the event will be recorded today, and the recording and slides will be made available on the portal this week. We will be using Slido a lot this session, so we do ask that you scan the QR code or use a joining link, or I will pop a link in the chat so you can have it either open in your phone or your browser. And there will be opportunities for a Q&A throughout, so if you do have any questions, pop them into Slido. And I will leave that on the screen just for a moment so everybody can sign into Slido, okay? And I'll pop a link in the chat now. And just while people are joining Slido, I will share the agenda with you all today. And as you can see, it is a very packed agenda. So yeah, I'll just leave that on the screen a moment. And I will hand over now to Anton.
Well, as ever, thanks for taking the time. It is really important to communicate and engage with you, particularly around some of the key things that guide our service. As ever, we've thought about in advance different aspects of our service that might be of interest to you, which involve, what are we seeing out there in the market, what's happening, how are things being improved for the market by the REC. What is kind of more urgent? What might you need to do in the next quarter, and the performance of REC services. So without further ado, I think we should get into it. I think the next bit is Alex will take us through. So if you can skip on the slides, please. So I'll just hand over to Alex, who's in our party assurance team, who will talk about some of the things we've seen in the market over the past quarter.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Anton. And then Jenny, if we can go to the next slide, please. Right, so I will be referring quite a lot to the annual report, which you can see here. It is also available on the REC portal under category 3 product documents page, or via this link, which I think the slides will be circulated later, so you can have a look. And then if we go to the next slide, please. Right, so while we encourage all of you to kind of read through the report in more detail, for those of you who kind of prefer a shorter version, a more succinct one, we have some key takeaways here. I won't read out the slide to you. What I just kind of want to point out is that overall, all of these kind of focus and I think evidence our commitment to tightening controls and audits. Obviously, we are looking to protect the market from outliners who kind of may not be exactly up to scratch risk-wise. And we are looking to apply kind of any improvements where we see issues. And a huge part of it is also listening to your feedback. In particular, we've kind of gotten some feedback around communication and engagement. So we've taken that to heart. Many of you would have probably heard from myself or one of my colleagues in the performance assurance party check-ins, which we've kind of started doing. Yeah, so we're kind of very focused on that. And then as well on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the distribution of the party ratings. So the vast majority of parties have no material weaknesses, which means we're kind of perfectly happy with their performance. And what I also wanted to share was where we kind of see the best performance in parties. We note that these are people who kind of positively engage with us, and they tend to be very proactive in how they approach the system. So they don't necessarily wait for us to kind of come and tell them that there's a problem or they're maybe over a threshold. They kind of monitor their own data and, monthly or kind of regularly, and they can take action before our team even kind of gets involved in this. So again, we're kind of looking to apply improvements, tighten the regulation and kind of tackle any issues in a way that is kind of proper and helps us all. And if we go to the next slide, please, Jenny. Right, so on here you can see the performance trends for the last quarter. It is overall really positive. So we've seen a whopping 47% reduction in the number of cases above thresholds. And if you are thinking to yourself, Alex, this is nonsense, it can't be that high, you're partially right. So this, we have to kind of caveat this by saying we paused reporting on retail risk 5 whilst kind of the process is reviewed. But even with that kind of taken into account, it's still a very positive movement towards kind of much less parties and much less cases being above thresholds. And then what I also wanted to point out to you was just underneath the text on the insights from the dashboard, you can see the little kind of circular bit there. So what that tells us is that in the vast majority of cases, more than 80% of cases, actually the paths we applied were notifications only. So what that means in essence is that all we've done is kind of notify the parties that they are above threshold. And then from there, the parties took action themselves and there was no further input required from our end. So we've seen very good engagement on this. Obviously, there are some instances where we've kind of been more involved or applied more paths, but in the vast, huge majority of cases, all we have to do is notify people, and then the parties. So you tend to be quite good in kind of fixing anything. We've also gotten approval from the PAP to do some specific topic monitoring on switching. So what we focused on in particular was the incorrect use of COO flags and the disproportionate levels of erroneous switches. Again, this is on the slide, so I won't read it out to you. But just to point out, these are the two things we've kind of focused on. If you are curious about our analysis and kind of our thoughts on this and the trends we've identified, please have a look at our report. So I will leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger there. And then if we move on to the next slide, please, Jenny. Right, so this kind of brings us to the arrow 155 section. So here on the left side, you can see a bit of a timeline of how this change came about through to implementation, which just happened a couple of days ago. In terms of kind of what the insights tell us, so they tell us suppliers are ready for this change. We have observed slight differences between larger and smaller suppliers. Kind of as expected, larger suppliers tend to rely on more comprehensive and automated processes, whereas smaller suppliers kind of have more informal processes. They rely more on like the team and individuals who perform them, which is very understandable and also quite interesting, we thought. Most suppliers kind of focused on the new SLAs, which are obviously a critical part of this incoming regulation. And they provided good quality working instructions. We've seen a lot of emphasis put on training staff, which is great to see. And yes, on the bottom there, you will see a thank you for all of those of you who submitted it on time. And again, it was the vast majority of people who did submit on time. Where we have seen kind of significant delays or a complete lack of engagement with us. Again, that's a very, very small number of suppliers. We have applied action plans and management assertions just to get them to kind of engage with us a little bit more. But yeah, a huge thank you to those of you who submitted on time. A special thank you for myself and Jade as well, because we've kind of been taking the brunt of the analysis alongside our management team as well. So a huge thank you to those of you who kind of managed to do it on time. It helped us avoid any overtime and kind of enjoy the summer months, which is excellent. And then if we go to the next slide, please, Jenny. Right, so on the kind of rec performance services and the next one, please. So we kind of provide, I guess, two main services, which is the performance monitoring and direct assurance. So the former helps us identify any problems proactively, as well as kind of, deal with it before it becomes more of a problem in the market. And then direct assurance is essentially how we I suppose get more, provide more trust, a level of trust and kind of comfortability in the accuracy and completeness of submissions made by parties. And then from these two activities, we kind of get or can squeeze out the insights that we need to kind of review KPIs. So we obviously want to continue to review our metrics and make sure they kind of are fit for purpose and they measure what we want them to measure and they are kind of fair and relevant. It also tells us a bit more about where we should maybe do a bit of a deeper dive. So where we should focus our analysis to understand a bit more about what is happening in the market and identify any improvement opportunities as well. And then finally, it also informs our approach to performance assurance techniques. So where we apply paths, how we apply them, what are the kind of, what kind of techniques we may want to apply and where to apply them to get the best results. And then if we go to the next slide, please, Jenny. Brilliant, thank you. So I mentioned the kind of deep dives previously. So in this quarter, we have focused on both the gas inquiry service and the electricity inquiry service. So from kind of those we managed to, again, these kind of help us to get a bit more understanding around performance trends and identify any improvement opportunities or kind of see if we can review the recent initiatives. Are they working how we expected? Is there anything we can do better? And how does this area of the service function as a whole? So these are all the three kind of priorities for this quarter. So we kind of looked at, any initiatives that we've had, analyzed key risks. And we've particularly zoomed in with paths where kind of performance was not met and we needed to see some more improvement. And with that, I can take a deep breath now and pass you over to Anton. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. We do have one question on R155 saying, seems all questions focused on change of occupier without a switch. What questions assurance have been asked for change of occupier with a switch?
Anton, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we assessed both situations. Paul, I think your business, not specifically you, asked some questions related to this and we're just working out the right way to respond to you. We looked at both those situations. They are both really important parts of the thing that changed as a result of 155, and they were both assessed. But I do know that there is an open query that you guys need to be responding to in relation to that. So yeah, both critical elements, both really important. We looked at processes, systems and guidance for each of them, and we understand particularly with a switch that that can have a really important impact on the consumer. So I'm just moving on to a different topic. One of the things that we always try and do is provide to you a clear idea of what work you might need to do that's interacting with us. So we put a little matrix on the screen, which is in the next slide. Now some of this is the same every quarter. So submitting monthly data, that's the same. So the things that I would like to call out are things that perhaps are different. So the annual rating for suppliers and DNOs following that consultation is a really important activity that you guys are probably quite interested in, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. I want to flag that that's applicable to those two organisations, or types of organisations probably, and really important that the activity that happens now, like this is the chance for a query window, this is the chance for you to validate and check everything's correct. Something that's quite related to that, which we will also be talking about later, is the theft detection incentive scheme completion. Similarly, there is some query window and opportunities to resolve data problems. Some of the others are kind of more standing items, but I just also wanted to call out, as things move through the change process, important activities for MEMS relating to data quality and reconciliation, relating to MTD reconciliation for electricity, that's coming down the pipe, and the gas reconciliation for CDSP, that's been processed, and we'll be working through those items. The final column does apply to everybody, so all types of parties and non-parties as well, which is the performance assurance operating plan development. So that's something that we want to do later in this meeting, which is get your views on where we should be focusing in the future. So it shouldn't be a surprise, but the most important call outs are the things that we wanted to spend time on later in this meeting. So if we can flick ahead to do some of these things. So as we've said, we're thinking about defining our priorities, thinking about an annual rating, and we're thinking about what's important in this period for energy theft, kind of that annual TDIS scheme. So I will be starting to talk to you a little bit about performance assurance priorities. What's really important to know is there's an interactive bit. We want your views, but I also want to build up our thinking so you can see into our minds a little bit. So I'll present a little bit and then we'll be asking you some questions, some polls. On to the next, please. So assurance is essential for a properly functioning code. And where does it sit? There are kind of lots of things that happen, but this is a kind of simplification of kind of the code management process. So obviously there is a very clear change process, but after things go to change, they go into operations. But when they're in operation, sometimes there are problems identified with them that feed back into the change process. Assurance fits in all of these stages. So we look at the most significant changes to understand it. Like if they're operating well, we just talked about R155, that's a super important thing. And some of those activities were there to check if people were ready, but also provide incentives for them to be ready. On the bottom line, whilst things are in operate, many times parties identify problems that need to be addressed, but it's also the responsibility of the code manager to be monitoring operation. That's performance assurance as well. And then sometimes when we know there's a problem, it's performance assurance's job to try and get underneath it a bit, to try and chunk that into changes, to try and understand what that is in more detail and provide evidence base. And actually that is a really important activity. Sometimes that demonstrates that the problems aren't significant enough to result in changes. Sometimes it makes the case more persuasively. But obviously we should be led by the evidence. So that's roughly the scope of our activity. If we flick on to the next, several of these are already in flight, so we can't kind of stop them. So MHHS, for example, is a program that wasn't of our choosing how that all works. But it does drive some work, including the need for improved meter technical details, data quality. We talked about R155. Clearly, over the next 3, 6, 9 months, that'll be the early days of that process. And that really is the relevant time to look and see if it's healthy and effective. And one of the things that's come out of a broader theft strategy is some ETOS lead matching. Obviously, in Operate, we've been doing that a while. I think that does need to continue. We shouldn't be switching off, looking at erroneous switches, but we need to respond to the market conditions there. And then we obviously need to support the projects that kind of come through from identification, help them get ready for the change process. So there are some stuff in flight. So if we move on, we need to define an annual plan. That's one of the things that we do. So we've done quite a bit already, but we want you to help us. So we got some stakeholder input. So you've provided service user surveys, including the annual survey. We've got inputs from service providers like RECO and DCC, and we've got input from other stakeholders. We also looked at what's working and what's not in the previous year, and we looked ahead to the change pipeline, although that is not entirely obvious exactly what that will be like in 12 months' time. We did a workshop with the PAB that came up with a whole load of ideas, and what we want to do in July is the PA webinar to further refine it, and then get to the point where we can consult on a plan Today, we won't be bringing to you a plan. This is more getting your input before it is, a kind of a timeline. And in August, we'll look for a PAB decision, which should then enable us to execute the plan from September. Okay, on to the next. There is quite a lot of performance assurance activity that's kind of predefined, kind of the momentum of the service, and they range from things that are like defining the code. So qualification, that's been the code. So changing that isn't something that can happen in a plan, to some that the PAB have determined. So, for example, a bit more input into TDIS verification. We've got a slide here that shows you that we are thinking about how long it takes us to do this, why we are doing this, and what the kind of benefits are. So the benefits sometimes arise to the consumer, but they also sometimes arise either to the systems or the rec processor. Sometimes that means market participants avoiding data issues being passed around. We think most of this is kind of predefined by their activity, but there are some areas perhaps where we could scale up or down. We've asked the PAB about the value they receive from these activities, and you should receive values from these activities as well. But we'd like to seek views from rec parties today. At that point, I think we might have a poll. So this is us trying to find a structured way to do this. So we've got a long list of things that we think are kind of predefined. We want to check they're still valuable to different parts of the market. So we'd like you to rate on the scale, and we're hoping this is quite quick. You can almost give us a Google review in different areas. So let's just take the top one, qualification. You might think qualification is absolutely unnecessary. If that is the case, you would rate it no stars or kind of 1 star. Sorry, 1 star. Don't do no stars, because then it'll think you haven't had an opinion. If you think it is the most important thing that's ever happened in the world of assurance, you would give that a 5 star. And the idea here is that if we get very clear steer from market participants and other stakeholders that things are really important, we'll make sure we retain them. And things are of a lower priority to you or other types of stakeholder, then we will see if we can, kind of find ways to reduce it and not, find ways to be proportionate with it. So I would hope that you can start clicking the buttons. If anybody wants to ask a question, if I've been unclear in how that's worked, please do say so now. But if not, give us your Google ratings.
I think we'll just leave that on the screen for a minute as well, because I can see that there are a few people responding. We already have 2 votes, and there are around 4 to 6 people completing that at the moment. So we'll just leave that on the screen. And for those who didn't have a chance to sign into Slido at the beginning of the webinar, the QR code is on the screen, the joining code is on the screen, and the link is in the chat if you wanted to open that in your browser.
So I'm obviously not rating this. Jenny, can you just give me a steer if after these are rated, people can see kind of the participants' scores?
The results are hidden. I can remove the hidden setting from that so that people are able to see.
And I think it would be helpful for people to see
Yeah,
that. It
sure.
would be helpful.
I think people would be able to see that once they vote. So I'll try to do that now.
And are we able to see that, Jenny? Just I certainly don't want to vote.
Sorry, I was on mute. I can present on the big screen, and show those results. Yeah, sure.
Should we just do that? So
Sure.
I don't plan on going through all 16 of them. So what I do want to do is highlight anything that seems kind of significant from the results, particularly things that are significant that might surprise us. Okay.
So Anton will have to go through each one kind of separately, but we can quickly breeze through it.
If we quickly breeze through it, so this wasn't consistent with the PAB. The PAB thought this was a very, very important activity, but perhaps it's more important over new applicants than it is over existing market participants. Perhaps this is more of an existing market participant call, but okay, I think that is different and worth commentary. Okay. Okay. I would say there's quite a wide set of views there. And actually it is interesting that people don't see this as valuable. You know, I think those 1s and 2s are probably quite challenging. Similarly, TDIS verification, wide range of views there. It's almost like we're getting a bell curve in every curve so far. We just move on. Similar bell curve. Okay, monthly review of PATs. It does seem like that's seen as slightly more important overall, but only slightly, just to keep monitoring that market information. Go to the next. Okay, well, that's really interesting. This, I would say, is probably a bit more negative. Actually, we have got feedback from others that sharing more peer comparisons would be a good way of us influencing the market and driving up performance. Actually, the market participant view here is kind of not positive in that space. If we move on to the next. Data cleanse is highly prioritized compared to the others. We should say it's still, most people are hitting the middle button, but you know, I think we can see that compared to the rest, there's a bit more of a priority. And CDSP reconciliation is fairly similar to that, isn't it? As a data cleanse activity.
Yeah, I don't know.
Slight focus on monitoring rec services, as that's a priority for the code manager to do. That is interesting. Perhaps with the PAB, the conversations were more about looking at the market participants, but I guess there is a slight preference there. Let's keep going. Which I think that's consistent with, isn't it? Fairly consistent. Slight preference. I think that is different, and most people hit a 3 there significantly. Less polarizing opinions, but still pretty average. And let's keep going. A positive view on the need for change process assurance. I think I would do that and keep going. Again, that looks like there aren't polarized views to me. Keep going. And overall, I'd say some slight positivity to do that. And then supporting other initiatives is really important. Okay. So this is the only one that's different, really. and then focusing on emerging risks is really important as well. So those, I think those were the last two, and those are coming out really important. So I'm not going to lie, I was kind of hoping there would be a strong view on focusing on emerging risks, because the next part of our presentation is how might we do that in a way that's more visible to you. So if we're thinking about enhancing this service and focusing on emerging risks and not just things that kind of already been managed, one of the things I think is people want to know clearly what is about to happen and what has happened, and perhaps there are improvements that could be made in that space. I guess the first thing that we need to do if we're making improvements is think about what are the driving principle. I think the most important driving principle here is the code is about multilateral interactions, and it's about having a consistent expectation across the market. Often code rules have been put in to benefit one group and require a different group to do something. So for example, a service provider might need to maintain their performance at a certain level of responsiveness, and it's not for them, is it? It's for the market participant to use it. A losing supplier might need to provide information or had maintained technical details, things like that, and they need to pass that on when there's a switch. So there is a kind of beneficiary, and the beneficiary normally isn't the person who has to do the thing. So whenever we do things, we need to think about that two-party relationship. The other thing that's really important, people want us to be predictable. Now, we can't focus on emerging risks and be entirely predictable. That's contradictory, but we need to work as much as we can to be predictable. To do that, in work on emerging risks, we want to see, wherever possible, have a scoping activity where we work with the beneficiary and we work with the responsible party to work out where it should focus. And those scopes should be things that kind of you can see, you can input in, you can see and is predictable for you. Clearly, there needs to be a kind of a delivery phase, which might involve us asking different types of party for support, and then an output phase, perhaps with an output that's shared not just in a webinar but as a report. I think what's really important as well is kind of improving code management in general, that clear intent of focusing on outcomes, customer outcomes particularly, but also outcomes for different market participants. So where we find outcomes are poor, PA should be delivering clear recommendations on what the next steps are. I think that's really important in all of this. But also where outcomes are acceptable, I think that's a case for continuing as we are. Those positive assurances just as important. Knowing what's working and kind of keeping it working is just as valuable as finding a problem and addressing it. If we flick on to the next. So in the emerging risk categories we're about to consult you on, essentially, we'll be looking to do some more visible outputs. The first one is a scope, which we will be working with responsible parties with. Clearly, there are lots of suppliers and there are lots of MEMS, etc. We can't work with you all, so we are hoping that either there'll be volunteers, or we can work with PAB representatives of these organisations, or perhaps with some groups of organisations with pre-existing bodies. This will mean it is predictable. You can see what's in scope. You can say, well, hang on, I can kind of see where you're getting at there, but that doesn't make sense. Let's change it. And the responsible party can also see kind of what is to be expected and what might happen. So these scopes are outputs that we expect to put into the market, and be clear about the input we'll need from parties. And clearly the output of these activities, we need an output, and I think those will be some reports that we'll share with the PAB for approval, and we expect to publish them for industry and the board. Depending on the subject matter, they might not be exactly the same, but we expect them to contain things like what was the scope, what was the results, what are the suggested actions required of the responsible parties, which could be the code manager, could be Breco or DCC, could be specific suppliers or other parties, and any further work that's required. It might be that assurance work identifies a need that then results in, for example, a change. If we move on, so this is just an example. If we were to look into the objections process, which we are considering as an option, not something we would do, the beneficiaries are kind of consumers and their advocates, and supplier representatives as well, because suppliers benefit from the ability for faster switching and more reliable switching. The responsible parties are also suppliers in this. So we would define the boundaries, the key areas of focus. We'd look at a delivery plan. We would see if we need information, particularly from suppliers or perhaps from other sources, the most obvious being the inquiry services and CSS. And we'd identify key stakes and an engagement plan, a little mini timeline. We'd share the report, which would have key insights, recommended actions and suggested completion dates. So hopefully that might put some flesh to the bones. If we flick on to the next. We have a lot of ideas where we could do this and add real value. We put 13 on the screen. 13 is a lot. We can't do 13 and do them well. That would be failing to prioritize. But we did want to get your input as part of this process. So we have here 2 different types of activity. On the left are things that are really about REC processes, things that REC parties do. So things like escalations and S-steps, things like data quality and cleanse, things like objections. I might as well read the rest out. Prepayment meter switching processes, electricity meter data, energy theft, and gas process improvement, looking at in the gas industry. If there has been an improvement in the processes and data resulting going under the REC. On the right are things about looking at how REC services are run and operated. So one is, we could spend time looking at information security of those key services. We could look at capacity management and if that's effectively managed. We could look at critical changes delivered by Breco and the code manager. We could look at the CSS improvement plan, which is looking at driving up performance. We could check if benefits are realised. We could deep dive into incident and problem management, and we could look at cross-code integration of code management services. Can't do all of that, but those are some really those are some really valuable things we think we could do. So the first question we have for you is, could you rank these in order of priority? You should have a poll, and we're treating the left hand and the right hand as kind of 2 separate rankings. So hopefully you should be able to select and rank from the list below, and we'd really appreciate that input. I'm more than happy, if any of this wasn't clear, for people to ask questions, whether that's through Slido or whether that's directly. But if not, please have a go at the poll. Okay.
Anton, I'm just wondering if you can see the Slido screen.
So the Slido screen is really clearly presented.
Okay,
I was just pausing because there's a couple more people ranking, and it's possible they agree, but it's also possible they have very different opinions. So the thing that's most telling to me is the top item is escalations and S-step. The reason this is on the list is because it comes out of PA check-ins that people have challenges working in this space quite frequently. What was notable in our discussions with PAB is this did not jump off the page for them. This wasn't a huge priority for them. But clearly you are there working these processes every day. Maybe that is an area that you have a different view. I think the next, I think they're tied, aren't they? But data quality and electricity meter data seem to be very important in this. We also thought objections, getting that right customer journey was quite an important thing, given how important switching and objections is to the whole purpose of the REC. And then if we just scroll down, we've got energy theft and gas improvement at the bottom. And that's quite unusual. Prepayment switching at the bottom as the lowest priority. Okay, that's really clear. It's really, really clear. So thank you for that. And if we show the other one, I think critical changes, that does seem very important. R155 being an example, but actually that's like a super clear message, isn't it? The others are of a lower priority to you. I see security is rated above, for example, capacity and the others, but it's number 1 jumps off the page and number 6 is at the bottom. Just to share what was the PAB's priority, and like, we are doing this to give the PAB more information and help them make a better decision. Cross-code integration was actually the thing that they were most interested in, as a real priority for an issue to tackle through assurance. But that's not what you guys are seeing. You guys are seeing making sure that the changes are effective is the most important thing. So thank you very much for that. There is an obvious thing that we haven't asked you, that we're about to ask you. We've put 13 options and we won't do all of them, but we might have missed the most important thing. That's certainly possible. So we just would like you to fill in, what are we missing? What would you like to raise for consideration for the next period? So I appreciate some of you may be writing essays that take a little bit longer. This will be sent with the REC bulletin because it's important that everybody gets a chance, isn't it? So a similar survey to this will be sent with the REC bulletin. So don't feel under pressure. If you might want to take it away, you'll still get your views. Perhaps that won't be as public, but all of these outputs, you'll have an opportunity to do, and we will take them all seriously. It's got a participant. I don't quite know what you're going to get with a free text answer, do you?
I think the character limit might be it's not too long, but I can leave the poll open for as we move on, and we can always just revisit it.
Should we revisit it?
Yeah, let's do that.
So just to talk about another matter that probably is very, very important, and is probably in a different part of our cycle as we come to the end of our annual cycle, a party annual rating. So if we move on, ratings are really, really useful. We've learned from other organisations with similarities to us. You can see the long list of organisations we've reviewed their outputs from, and we're keen to learn from these organisations, drive transparency, performance and trust. Party ratings are in the code as a peer comparison, which has specific governance over it to make sure it's well managed, particularly scrutiny by the PAB. We can use party ratings to do a few things: reduce the direct demands on parties, as we can use comparative measures over time, and create incentives. We can also communicate more clearly about the work we do. So if we move on to the next thing, we've done this before. This is not the first time through, and we've been deliberately gradual. So initially we shared risk driver scores, we shared ratings with parties confidentially, and we've shared ratings with peers, by which I mean a supplier can see another supplier's rating. This approach has been to provide it to DNOs and suppliers, mainly because they've got more measurable obligations, and it's focused on kind of a set of activities: qualification, PATs, energy theft. So if we just move on, I've talked to you previous activities like this through a cycle, and we're moving down that cycle. So we've already discussed with the PAB the way this can be applied in 24-25. The RECO board has input into the decisions. We've consulted on our approach, and the RECO board determined to continue with the current year's approach, or the previous year's approach, of sharing with peers and not a broader sharing. We've met the code requirements for publication, and we've published our methods, including timelines and criteria. We will implement a query window as we've done in the past, and the PAB has had probably its most important decision last month. The PAB is involved in kind of August and September, just to kind of make sure that the peer comparison is kind of operating as expected. So if we move on. So we recently consulted, and we did hear from you. The non-confidential responses are uploaded as part of the PAB pack. There were different views. You never get exactly the same thing from consultation, but there were some really clear messages out there. So I think people agreed that we should continue with DNOs and suppliers, and that we'll look to explore how this could be applied to MEMS in future years. Non-domestic suppliers were clear that they had concerns relating to theft ratings, particularly those working outside the small medium enterprise segment, kind of I&C suppliers. This wasn't shared by all suppliers, but I think that segment did speak clearly. One particular party said it was a bit confusing how it works, and I'm going to try and address that now by giving you some worked examples. There were alternatives raised around multiple ratings, a single rating. All of them had clear rationales, and to be honest, all of them were workable approaches. There were also some really practical suggestions. One of the things we did ask, we set out the controls that we have in place over these ratings, and we did ask if there were other things that should take place, and there was general support. There were some helpful comments on how these things could be tweaked, but they weren't fundamental changes. There were also some wider suggestions. There was someone, for example, who suggested that one of the criteria we should do is if people are submitting data on time, for example. We'll consider these for future periods, and all this information was provided to the PAB. So if we move on to the next. So the PAB then decided that a single rating approach will continue, and the primary reason for this is so that it can include energy theft. We're quite thoughtful about information that we put out about energy theft, because there is an interrelation between the information that's out there and the information that people who might steal are aware of, and that might necessarily create the right results. That a tailored non-domestic theft criteria will be applied, and that the other consulted upon criteria will be approved. So essentially we said, these are the things that we think they should be. Do you support them? And those criteria essentially will go ahead. They asked us to explore further peer comparisons, and the first one we will do is a theft one. That probably is the one with the most complexity and subtlety, so probably the one to crack on with. There's also a discussion on how it could be quite confusing to apply this. So in this meeting, we're providing some examples. So if you flick on, please. So these are the approved criteria, and it is a little bit complicated. You should see in the far left area there that there is a new target that applies for non-domestic energy suppliers only relating to energy theft. So you can see that it has a similar structure to before, but the ratings and bandings are different. We provided to the PAB market performance from domestic and non-domestic groups and used that as evidence to set where the bandings are. We continue to think that it is a severe problem if energy suppliers do not confirm any thefts, but most crucially, do not attempt to identify any or engage within the scheme at all. We continue to think that in any sector is a problem. However, we do recognise in I&C that the distribution of theft is different and it is less likely that you will be catching energy theft than in domestic or domestic premises. So we've got gentler bandings in this. So you can see that the concepts are the same, but they are calibrated to that difference in the non-domestic sector. The rest of the criteria are the same as previously. So the performance assurance techniques criteria are the same. So if you have one of the kind of more involved PATs applied to you, for example, the specific condition PAT or referral to Ofgem, these are very, very significant things that that aren't handled lightly. You attract a worse rating, and kind of more medium-sized PATs attract a lower activity. As ever, things where we are looking into, like investigating, do not result in a worse rating. So if something strange happens with your data and we raise an inquiry, and then following that we do something more formal with an information request, this doesn't necessarily mean that there is a problem there. But what we will do in those circumstances is determine if further action is needed by you, and that might result in kind of the end of that process, or it might result in a validated issue and therefore an action plan, or if something's worse, a management assertion. Similarly, maintenance of qualification, proper engagement in that process will drive no negative scores, and maintaining within your CME conditions, if you have them, will retain a better score. In the bottom, we've just suggested that the energy theft criteria don't really work for the smallest organisations. If you have an energy theft target of 1, you're kind of probably going to get 0 or 1, aren't you? And these criteria don't quite work. So in both segments, a de minimis applies. So if you've got 0.5% of the theft pot, so if you've got small market share, essentially, those theft targets don't apply. So to try and provide an example of how these things might work, we wanted to provide 3 examples. Do bear with me. Hopefully this is clear and a good way of addressing that confusion. So the first example is a DNO, and this DNO is not in CME. They've met their maintenance of qualification requirements. They submitted on time and completed that activity. They did have data cleanse targets, but they didn't quite hit them, and they had an information request. They subsequently did not resolve these or cleanse the data. They were setting an action plan. DNOs aren't part of the theft scheme. For this example, we ignore the criteria not relevant to the party. We categorise the remaining criteria and identify the lowest performing area as the rating. We'll visualise this. So if we flick on, so you can see energy theft's just not relevant. That's just grey, just ignored. CME is just grey. That's ignored. We've identified that their maintenance of qualification, they met those requirements, and there's kind of no negative thing there. In the PATs, they had an action plan, a single one, so that would attract any minor weaknesses. And if we compare these 2 ratings, we take the one that's least favourable, the minor weaknesses, it's relevant. So this reflects a single area of a performance issue, and that feels proportionate. That feels like that rating is working. got two more of these, so please be patient to those who already understood it. There's probably more going on for suppliers. So if we have an example supplier, they're not in CME, they've met their main qualification requirements. We have investigated their objections because they were higher, but actually it was in line with the code. However, there was some evidence of some more significant objection problems later in the year, and PAB decided to restrict their access to switching. Later that was opened up due to further improvements in performance. They've met 98% of their data cleanse target on time, so we issued an inquiry and they resolved that. And crucially, they achieved 26% of their theft target and 24% electricity and 28% in gas. And this is a non-domestic supplier. So if we flick on, so you can see the domestic target doesn't apply, and others to CME. And actually in energy theft, they did pretty well on the score, no material weakness. And in qualification, they did well. They did have an action plan, but their specific condition pack was because of real problems in objections, some real significant issues, and that attracts them a severe weakness. So a really important area of underperformance directly drives a severe weakness statement, a single one. So if we move on to the last example, so final one, this is kind of a supplier operating in all market segments. They're not in CME, they met their main qualification requirements. They've actually triggered the kind of alerts on the risk drivers quite a few times, but these were all resolved. They met 98% of their data cleanse target on time, and they were issued an inquiry, but they resolved that matter. And they had 31% of theft detection for non-domestic customers, and they've achieved 58% for their combined theft for domestic customers. We've created this example to explain the theft criteria in the bottom left. So if we move on, how does that work? We take out the irrelevant area, the CME breach. Whilst they have had areas investigated, there's nothing attracted there that has attracted a more challenging category. So no material weaknesses. They worked on their qualification. This is all about this bottom left area. So you can see in the bottom left, they have 25%, over 25% on non-domestic, but in the 40 to 60% in the TDIS target. That attracts a minor weakness overall. So you take the worst of the criteria. This is driven by domestic thefts. So they were provided the same criteria. So if you're non-domestic only, you do get that bottom left, that very far bottom criteria. If you're operating in both segments, this is how we apply the criteria. This is the last worked example. If anybody either wants to put their hand up and query anything that's been unclear or pop something in the Q&A, please do, because we've spent that time to try and make it as understandable as possible. It's always important to finish a section like this to think about next steps. So we'll now implement the query window. This is a really key control. So that means we will provide draft ratings to you. And if you're like, I don't get it, I did submit my main qualification on time, that doesn't make sense, we can look into it, we can understand it, we can validate it, we can all stand solidly on the same data. We'll provide ratings for the PAB and to finalise the publication, and we'll continue to think about how we can develop this assurance regime guided by the RECO board and the PAB. For example, we talked about earlier whether theft peer comparisons, things like that might be a positive step that will help us drive this annual rating overall forward. So I do think there were some things in the Q&A.
Yeah, there were a couple questions. The first one is, as a supplier in both domestic and non-domestic markets, will a higher target disadvantage us? That one has disappeared. But... That was the general gist of it.
I don't think it will disadvantage you. So firstly, there's the de minimis. So if you genuinely are very small, it kind of doesn't apply. But if we think about what it might have been otherwise, it would have just been that. Do you mind just flicking back? Go to the left, flick back. So if you see this, oh, sorry, I just want that table. So if you see this table, in the previous periods, like it obviously had the headers, but it only had the domestic line, and that was applied to domestic and non-domestic. And now it has a second line under it, which is kind of a less tricky to hit non-domestic target to reflect that different customer behaviour in I&C. I don't think the creation of that line will disadvantage anyone. I think it should reflect fairly. If you've got a mixed portfolio, it should reflect for you fairly. There is a second URL question. I'm not entirely sure what this relates to. If it relates to the R0155 RFI responses, we didn't ask that energy suppliers who were in scope of this provide public information. We asked that they provide information to us so that we can assess it. We can conclude on if anything needs to be different, or any actions taken. So we wouldn't publish those responses. We've provided some information in this webinar, but that isn't kind of a thing that we do in that way. If the question was about something else, if it's about responses to consultation, we can provide the link to where the responses to the consultation on annual on the annual rating. We can certainly provide that to you. And perhaps we just share that in the chat. Presentation to click here. Okay. We can share that with you. Paula, we can share that with you directly afterwards. Okay. If we just click on, and one more. So I'm just going to pass over to Andrew, who's going to take us through Energy Pro.
Thanks, Anton, and morning, everybody. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to cover three things during the session, just various updates around theft. So the first is the closeout, I guess, of the 24-25 scheme year. So that was for the period ending March this year. So just sort of really to remind people of some of the activities that are happening at the moment and actions that as suppliers involved in the theft scheme. So apologies for those who aren't suppliers on the call, but for the suppliers who are in the theft scheme, that you should be aware of and need to take. So the final figures in terms of submissions provided through to the beginning of June deadline are available on the dashboards, and they should reflect final numbers. And as previously communicated, you should be checking that those numbers that you're seeing for your particular party are as you expect per your records. And obviously, if you've got any queries on that, to raise those. Obviously, please, if you have got queries, the sooner you raise them, the better, because we need to obviously work through those to then be able to get through the rest of the process. So please don't sit on them. We also do need to have details if there have been any scenarios where you have acquired or disposed of your customer book in the year. So there's a specific rule in the scheme that deals with that scenario. So if you have either bought a customer book from another supplier and it needs to be bought basically the whole book, the language in the current drafting is substantially all, or if you have sold substantially all, then you please let us know. We're obviously aware of a number, and we're engaged with parties on that already. But if you haven't let us know that, please do. We don't have a direct way of seeing that sort of commercial activity has happened. We've also got some ongoing queries. So obviously you guys look at the data and check it as you expect it. We also do have a look at the data just in terms of any oddities or anomalies we see within that. And we've been again engaging with individual parties directly on that. So if you've had messages through from us to say, hey, we've got these thefts, we've got a bit of an open question on them, again, please do come back. I know a number of parties again already have done that, and thanks for those who responded and done so very timely. So we appreciate your engagement in that process. Final date for any queries you have on those numbers that are in the dashboard is the 15th of July. So obviously in a couple of weeks' time. But as I say, that is a deadline, not a target. Ideally, we don't get a bunch to turn up on the 15th because obviously we need to then work through those. And we do need to have done the final debit and credit calculation by the 22nd of August, as it says on the slide there. So we need to have closed all those queries off before we can do the debit credit calculation. So my key message is, if you've got a question, please engage early, and do make sure you've checked those numbers. What you really want to confirm is that the number of confirmed thefts we're showing for you in the relevant pot is as you think you have submitted to us. That's the key thing you need to be checking. That's probably everything on 24-25. We'll communicate again once the debit credit calculation has been performed, and that all gets published through the dashboards. I'm sure many will be familiar with it, but the target tab has some extra columns in it that we use once the calculation is done to also include that information. So that'll get published in August, and then that will go through the Reco Finance team for invoicing in the subsequent invoicing cycles. So if you are a recipient of money from the scheme, you have to wait until we've had the payments in. So if you are paying into the scheme, you'll see that in your rec invoice. I think that's normally in the October invoice, and then once that has all been paid in, then the associated credits are issued out. And just as a reminder, the scheme works on a sort of cost neutral basis. So if for any reason there is under collection, then that affects what's paid out. So you might get 99 pence in the pound type thing if that were to occur. I think there's been very limited amount of that in the past few years, but just to make sure he's aware of that. That's only on 24-25. So if we move to the next slide, second was an update around R173 and then the associated now R259 change. So again, I'm sure many of you will be aware, R173 was being developed over the course of the last 12 months or so through the TIG working group, and essentially 173 provides the mechanism for a reduced level of incentive payment, but an incentive payment for completed but non-confirmed thefts that are either site visits or desktop only, but were driven off NetOff's lead. So that change originally we were hoping was going to go live 1st of April. You again may be aware that got sent back by Ofgem, and so that sort of missed that date. So a new change, but Ofgem have subsequently come back now and approved the decision. So on 2nd May. So there's an associated change, R259, which is open at the moment for consultation. The slides, when they come out, that 259 is a link you can click on, or obviously you can just go to the change pages. The current proposal is that will be implemented on the 1st of October, i.e. effectively halfway through the scheme year. So that would mean any investigations that met the criteria that that closed, because they won't be confirmed after the 1st of October, would then be in that scheme. So we'd have a sort of half year for the 173 related changes for this year, and then obviously that would go into normal from the following year for the 1st of April. That will mean, if that is what goes ahead, and you've got until I guess Friday to respond on that one, but assuming that is the date that goes ahead, the change would go in. I think the change would technically go in very late September, but with an effective from the 1st of October. Practical terms, what that really means is the updated reporting that's necessary to underpin that change. So there are some changes to the file format. The first time that data would need to be submitted would be the beginning of December, because we've got that kind of month and a bit lag sort of thing. So October data, the first time that's reported is the beginning of December. So if you haven't already, and I'm sure many people were looking at it, because I think the expectation was originally this would have gone in at the beginning of April. There were some changes in the park. It's mostly addition of a couple of additional fields that are needed to be able to categorise the new rules that would apply. And there's also actually some fields that have been removed to strip out some data that is sort of depreciated data items that aren't required. So those coming out at the same time. We're also expecting, and Ofgem have made clear that they expect this to happen, that once this kicks in, there'll be a step up in the level of assurance activities done over theft submissions. Just because of the perhaps slightly higher risk of gaming and with this change. So we'll share more detail on that as that develops out. In reality, obviously we'll need the data to come through for a few months. So that's likely to be something that will start to really happen in 2026. Kind of our current expectations, that'll be a combination of spot checks effectively on individual theft submissions. So there's a defined set of material you need to have to consider something to meet the various states. We would effectively be asking to see that for a sample that we select, and then we may also select some parties where rather than sampling odd ones and twos that maybe look a little bit interesting. Actually, we sort of say, well, there's a number of things, so we're actually going to have a look more at the process and controls you've got over the theft reporting rather than like the individual spot checking as well. So looking at a blend of those two approaches is the current thinking, but more to follow on that as that develops now that we've had the change approved by Ofgem and that clear direction from them. So yeah, if you've not already responded on 259, do go take a look. We did do a poll at the TIG around this date as well. So again, many of you are probably on that meeting. So that was second update, and then the third update. So if we go to the next slide, is to give you a bit of a heads up. And again, there'll be more on this. So this is kind of initial kind of heads up, and then we're going to do some further communication on this over the summer. And this is sort of in support of, in many ways, the 173 change, but also in support of wider theft reduction activity that ultimately RECO driving through the theft strategy. So we're basically looking to bring in some additional analysis around ETOS leads and how they are or aren't being worked. So we'll basically be matching leads. So we get a source through from Crime Stoppers of the leads that have been distributed. We've obviously got the theft investigation submissions coming through from parties, and we're going to be basically marrying that up to see whether those ETOS leads are being worked, and therefore also are they being worked timely, and how do they perform? Are they are ETOS lead generally resulting in a higher, if you like, conversion rate to confirm theft, a lower conversion rate, higher volume, lower volume, whatever it might be. So there'll be some back-end changes that we make to facilitate that. Initially, that will match based on meter point, and we'll have a sort of time window concept because you might be investigating a meter point 2 years ago, and then a lead comes in yesterday. Those are not related, so we need to sort of window box it. Once the 173 changes go in, one of the changes is to report the ETOS lead if you have investigated it. So obviously we'll flip over to using that once that's available. So we will do the matching, and then we'll make some changes to the dashboards. Broadly, we're going to change one of the bits on the theft summary report, which has a sort of slightly redundant chart at the moment. So there's leads and investigations, and they're kind of the same thing at this point. So it's kind of, we don't need both charts, so we're gonna replace one, and then we're going to add a whole new tab which will give a breakdown of the results of the analysis. So what's been matched, kind of what the lag and lead times are, what the outcomes are. That'll be available similar to the theft summary. So you will be able to look at your performance as a supplier individually and see all that detail, and then you'll be able to see everybody else's, but on an anonymized basis. So you can kind of compare and contrast. And And then we will also add some stuff to the row level detail to show you, well, these are the leads we have that we think you've had issued to you, and this is what we've matched them up to. So again, if you're seeing in the dashboards, we've got a load of Ethos leads that kind of Code Manager doesn't think we've worked, you'll be able to see which ones they are, and obviously, then engage with us in terms of, oh no, we think we have, and we can obviously look at, is there something in the matching or whatever it might be that driving that. So that's been worked on literally right now, in terms of a lot of the back end work that needs to happen, and then develop the dashboards. We will obviously be updating guidance and wiki and so forth. And we'll do an additional session. I think it'll be out of cycle with the PA webinars, so we'll do a dedicated session for it, to basically walk you through those dashboards and the changes. We're planning to go live with the changes, so with the matching and the reporting from September. So my expectation would be we'll be doing a lot of that walkthrough activity in August. Obviously, a bit of a balance. We decided not to go live in August because, obviously a bit of a higher level of people out with the summer holidays. Clearly, that means you might be out for some of the walkthrough. We'll obviously record all of those, so that if you are absent, then you'll be able to watch it back. But hopefully, this will be additive to you, and obviously particularly in the context of 173, where Ethos lead investigations will have the opportunity to attract an incentive. So going live a couple of months before that sort of starts to kick in is hopefully helpful. So that's one change that's coming up around matching. And then if we just go on to the final, I think 2 slides, and we're also going to put in place some enhancements to some of the validation checks. So there's a couple of parts to this. So there'll be a couple of changes to the checks that apply literally as you load the file into the portal. So the portal does those initial checks and gives you the results back of that. And then we're going to add some additional checks that the portal doesn't have the functionality to support just now, in the sort of as we then process that data. So as we do at the moment, for example, if you submit a badly formatted meter point reference number, that'll get through if it is a number, the portal validation, but then we will report that as a rejected theft within your dashboard, and it's obviously there in the screen for you to have a look at. What we're basically going to do is going to add some additional checks there, and we're going to add a new concept of a sort of warning flag. So we'll have accepted, rejected as we do today, and then we'll have a third category of a sort of warning. So the warning will be things like very high or very low kilowatt hour figures associated. So if you're putting everything with a 0, dates that look significantly out with what we would expect, or that sort of don't make sense in terms of, I know it's kind of two-day investigation, but very high volume, so those sorts of things. If you then submit a replacement record because the either the rejection or the warning has triggered you to look at that, then we will basically clear that validation. So we'll replace it because we always take the latest view, and we'll put some tracking in so you can also see that. So we'll show you did have this. You gave us a new version of that investigation ID, and therefore we've replaced that record. To be clear, there are no rejection reasons, so no reasons that say we won't accept a theft in that are not already within the park. So we're not adding new rules here per se. What we're effectively doing is just tightening up the the enforcement of a couple of those, and then the warnings are more things that are based on analysis of data over the last couple of years. We've seen issues with data coming in. Sometimes that's had knock-on effects. So as you'll be aware, some of the data gets passed across to Xserve to load into the gas processes, and there's currently an open discussion around something similar with the DNOs on electricity. So obviously, if there's like bad volume data coming in, that has a knock-on effect. So we're just trying to provide that insight, ultimately improving the quality of the data that's available from the theft scheme, which is obviously good for the theft scheme, but is also good for when that's used as part of wider theft strategy work to make sure there's the best available information around what is and isn't happening in the market. So, but as I say, if you're submitting a compliant file now, you should have no issue with any of this. There should be no new issues. We're just there's a couple of rules that are in the part that are not 100% applied, and we're just sort of tightening those down. The next slide, I think, if I remember correctly, just has a little bit more detail. Yeah, so postcode format needs to be a valid format. We're not actually postcode looking it up, but it needs to be a valid format. There's a couple of fields that are mandatory. So investigation closed and this report source. They are mandatory for confirmed at the moment. They should actually be mandatory for a couple of other statuses. So putting those in. There will be checks to make sure you don't say I confirmed a theft in 2029 or something when it's only 2025. So it's quite hard to finish some work 4 years ahead of time. Nice that might seem. And as I say, consistency of dates and sort of numbers that look a bit erroneous. Again, we're going to be sharing some more information on this, updated guidance, updated wiki pages, etc., and a walkthrough of like how that looks in the dashboards and how that works before we go live. So as that comes out, obviously take a look at that. Let's say hopefully what this will do is improve the quality of data in there. And will also feed into some of that additional assurance activity that we talked about in terms of the changes coming off 173. So just to summarise on theft, we've got the scheme year that's closed, kind of in its final processes. Key thing is check your numbers, come back to us ASAP, must come back to us by the 15th of July. If you come back after the 15th, the window is closed. There's nothing we can do there because we do need to draw a line because we have to move forward. Secondly, the changes that were originally 173 are now approved by Ofgem, and we're just working out the date of when they'll go live. So do respond to that consultation. And then thirdly, a couple of upcoming changes that we're making in terms of the wider operation of the scheme and some of the reporting and dashboards. On those, as I say, there'll be more opportunity to engage on those in the future. So this is a sort of first warning flag rather than final warning flag, as it were, but just to make sure people are aware these things are going on. That was on theft. I'll just pause in case there are any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. There aren't any questions at the moment, so cool. I think we'll wait until the Q&A session and see if there are any there.
So over to me to think a little bit about the future. We did this about this time last year. We asked what you'd be interested in, how we could improve these things. So let's just look back at what we've done. So we did a metering deep dive in December. In March, there was an annual rating, initial discussion, energy theft, and you've been to this meeting, so I don't need to tell you what's in it. At the next webinar, we will propose a plan for 2025-26 engagement. And these sessions will align with the PAOP, which is kind of the same concept as before. But we will also look at key activities, look at things that are emerging or any insights that have arisen from that date. So that's the current plan for webinars. I think there is a slide to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to cover? Clearly, when we will cover it might be heavily influenced by our plan. I want to come to you, we've got something interesting to say. But certainly we want to cover the things that you want us to cover. Anyone's typing, so we might need to move on. So I think we're on to Q&A. So hopefully you've been using the Slido, so you should be able to put Q&A in the chat. I was told there was something that possibly was kind of Q&A commenty, but from before in one of the polls, which did relate to being aware of the demands on energy suppliers relating to MHHS, and we should acknowledge as well it's important that we're aware of the demands on metering providers as well coming through for MHHS in the coming year. I do think it is a tricky balance that we need to meet. but like clearly MHHS is different. I know we had the switching program, which was also pretty massive, but these really are big demanding things, and we do need to get that balance right and not be overly demanding. I totally recognise that.